In a small village tucked deep within northern India, the ordinary hum of rural life was shattered by the crackle of flames and a scream that no one could forget. A woman, Priya Sharma, was found burned inside her bedroom. Her daughters, barely teenagers, were locked in the room next door. They pounded the walls, clawed at the door, and screamed until their throats gave out. But no one came, and even if someone had, it would have been too late. By the time the neighbors forced their way in, the fire had done its job. The neighbors called it a tragic accident, perhaps just another cooking mishap in a home where kerosene lamps and gas stoves lived dangerously close together. The family, led by Priya's husband, called it fate. A cruel twist, a moment of misfortune that took a wife and left behind motherless girls. And just like that, the story almost vanished. No police inquiry, no forensic team, no autopsy. Just a grieving husband with tears in his eyes and a community that nodded quietly and moved on. But smoke doesn't just rise from wood and cloth, it rises from secrets. And behind this particular blaze was something far more sinister. It wasn't a faulty stove. It wasn't fate. It was years of invisible wounds. Wounds carried in silence by a woman whose only crime was giving birth to daughters. A man whose obsession with producing a male heir turned into cold contempt. And a house that looked ordinary from the outside, but was, in truth, a prison. Priya Sharma had lived through a quiet war. She endured the pressure of forced abortions, the weight of shame for things beyond her control, and the cruelty of a man who measured her worth in chromosomes. No one heard her cries when she was alive, but someone did after she was gone. A single letter, born in grief and defiance, traveled farther than anyone imagined. It found its way into the hands of officials. It spread across newsrooms. It flooded television screens and courtroom benches. It awakened a country too used to looking away. This is the story of Priya Sharma. Welcome to the Crime Series. I am glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you are watching from. In the quiet village of Surapore in Uttar Pradesh, India, Priya Sharma was born into a life of modest means and simple expectations. Her father, Ram Dutt, ran a small grain shop in the village market, respected though never wealthy. Her mother, Shanti Devi, worked as a midwife, known throughout the community for her calm hands and quiet strength. She helped bring hundreds of children into the world, yet her own home remained humble. A tin-roofed structure, worn but filled with love. Priya was the eldest of 4 siblings, a girl who learned early that duty came before dreams. She spent her childhood balancing school with chores, helping her mother during home births when needed, and watching her father barter for sacks of rice and pulses. She was smart, but more importantly, she was grounded, sharp with numbers and quick to adapt, always finding ways to help the family earn a little extra. By the time she turned 19, Priya had taken to trade. With a basket of bangles, bindis, and household items, she began selling at the village haat, India's traditional market. People trusted her. Her voice was soft, her tone polite, and her prices fair. Slowly, she built a name for herself, not as someone ambitious, but as someone dependable. At 21, her life changed. She was married to Rakesh Sharma, the only son of a prominent cloth merchant. The match was praised by both families. Rakesh was seen as respectable, mild-mannered, modestly educated, and poised to inherit a successful textile business. The wedding was simple, adorned with marigolds and cautious smiles. Priya's family gave what little they could. But marriage, as Priya would soon discover, was not a destination. It was a battlefield hidden behind doors. Rakesh was a man shaped not by compassion, but by expectation. Raised in a household where daughters were seen as liabilities and sons as saviors, he had absorbed one belief fully, that a man's name only lived on through a male heir. And a woman's worth was measured by how soon she could provide one. In public, Rakesh was mild-mannered. He touched feet respectfully, spoke softly to elders, and played the part of a dutiful son. But in private, the mask slipped. He was cold, distant, exacting. He demanded obedience, silence, and most of all, results. And to him, a daughter was not a result. Priya tried. At first she reasoned with herself that adjustment takes time, that arranged marriages are not built on love but on habit, on mutual compromise. She waited for affection, for respect, but none came. When she gave birth to their first daughter, Meera, the look on Rakesh's face was not joy. It was disappointment. Still, she loved fiercely. Meera was the light in her world, a curious child with wide eyes and a stubborn streak, just like her mother. But her birth also widened the emotional gulf between Priya and her husband. Conversations became commands. The warmth that once existed turned to cold shoulder and silent judgment. When Nisha was born 3 years later, things turned darker. The disappointment deepened into cruelty. Rakesh began pressuring Priya to undergo sex-selective testing for her next pregnancies, pressures that came with unspoken threats. When tests didn't show a male fetus, he demanded terminations, each one more traumatizing than the last. These weren't just procedures, they were violations. Her body, once her own, had become a battleground for his obsession. And each time, Priya emerged weaker, physically and emotionally, but more determined to survive. She clung to what gave her purpose. She kept her small trade business alive, selling quietly from home. She stitched into the night, sari falls, school uniforms, baby frocks, anything to earn extra money for her daughter's education. She said little, complained less. The bruises she bore were hidden beneath long sleeves, the sadness in her eyes masked behind polite smiles. The neighbors noticed. They saw the way she walked slower, the way she flinched at sudden sounds. But in a village like Surapore, suffering was expected of women. It was stitched into wedding vows and folded into kitchen routines. No one asked, no one intervened. Still, Priya endured. She poured all her love into her daughters, Meera and Nisha. Meera, now a bright, observant teenager, had learned early to read her mother's silences. She watched. She remembered. Nisha, younger and softer, clung to her mother like a shadow, offering laughter in small doses, her innocence shielding her from the full weight of the truth. Together they were Priya's reason to keep going. They were her legacy. And in them, she saw hope. But even hope, when cornered too long, can burn. Then came June 14, 2016. It was a sweltering morning like any other. But within minutes, smoke began to rise from the Sharma household. Neighbors rushed over, banging on the doors, only to find them locked from the outside. Inside, Priya's room was in flames. Her daughters, trapped in the adjoining room, screamed and pounded on the door, helpless. By the time the door was forced open and Priya was pulled from the fire, it was too late. She was rushed to Safdarjung Hospital in New Delhi, burned beyond recognition but somehow clinging to life. After Priya was rushed to the hospital, he moved quickly to conceal what happened with the intention of changing the narrative to what happened as an accident. As neighbors gathered in confusion and the smell of burnt cloth lingered in the air, Rakesh wore grief like a mask, shaking his head, repeating the same lines. It was an accident. She must have spilled the kerosene herself. The stove burst. He said it so often, with such convincing sorrow, that even those who had heard shouting the night before began to doubt their own memories. He told the girls to stay silent, told them the village wouldn't understand, that people would blame them. He warned them that no one would believe little girls over their father, that they'd end up in an orphanage if they opened their mouths. And then he moved on. After spending few days in the hospital, Priya gave up. The family said it was an accident. Some called it whatever suited their narrative, but her daughters knew better. They had seen the truth, and they would not stay silent. This was not the end of Priya Sharma ordeal. It was only the beginning. The local constable wanted to investigate before concluding if it was an accident, but Rakesh paid off the local constable to skip the investigation. He arranged for a quick cremation, but changed it last minute to a quiet burial, claiming the family preferred it. No post-mortem, no questions, just a signed form of a grieving husband. But not everyone forgot. Inside that house, inside the scorched walls where Priya took her last breath, two daughters were watching. Teenage Mira and her younger sister, Nisha, had seen the truth. They had seen their father pour kerosene. They had heard the bolt slide shut from the outside. They had pounded on their own locked door until their fists bled. And they had watched, helpless, as flames consumed the only person who had ever truly protected them. Mira stopped speaking to anyone after that day. Not out of defiance, but devastation. Grief had taken her voice, and fear had filled the silence. She no longer answered questions, no longer looked up when spoken to. The world had become a blur, too loud, too fast, too hollow. But silence, it turned out, wasn't surrender. If you found this story compelling and appreciate the way we bring real-life cases to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue to uncover the truth and share these important stories. Like, share, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. In the weeks that followed her mother's death, while the world moved on and her father resumed his carefully rehearsed routine of mourning, Mira was watching, listening, remembering, and quietly she was preparing. Then one morning, while the sun spilled through the dusty window of their mother's old sewing room, Mira made a decision that would change everything. Alone in the corner, she found a small blade. She pricked her fingertip. A single drop of blood welled up. With shaking fingers, she began to write. Not with ink, but with blood. The words were simple, but they cut deeper than any accusation could. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She testified. She told the truth. That her mother had not died in an accident. That Rakesh Sharma, her father, had locked them in a room and set fire to their mother's bed. She wrote about the years of coercion and forced abortions, the threats that followed each birth of a daughter, and the long, slow erasure of a woman who was punished simply for not bearing a son. She ended the letter with a single plea. Please don't let him bury the truth like he buried her. And then Mira folded it and addressed it not to a teacher or a constable, but to the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, one of the most powerful officials in the state. It was a bold act, a desperate one. But it worked. The letter traveled, first to the post office, then from one confused government worker to another. At first, it was dismissed as a prank. Then someone noticed the stains, read the content, realized the weight. By the time it reached a desk that mattered in Lucknow, it was no longer just a letter. It was a warning, a reckoning. A blood-written message from a teenage girl, accusing her own father of homicide, was impossible to ignore. News outlets caught wind of it. Local journalists rushed to confirm the story. Hashtags trended. Social media erupted with outrage. Suddenly, what had been just another village tragedy became a national conversation. And then, the police returned to Surapore. But this time, they weren't bringing garlands or condolences. They came with cameras, warrants, notebooks. This time, they came to investigate. Mira and Nisha were brought in, not as orphans of misfortune, but as primary witnesses in a homicide case. And when the time came to speak, they didn't flinch. Mira, who had not spoken a full sentence in weeks, sat upright in the small interrogation room of the district office. Her hands clenched in her lap, her voice low but clear. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble. She recounted, step by step, what had happened the morning of June 14th. She told them how the door was bolted from the outside, how they screamed, how they saw their mother soaked in kerosene through the small slit between a curtain and a half-closed window, how they had heard the strike of a match, and then her screams. Nisha, younger but no less resolute, confirmed everything. With childlike honesty and chilling clarity, she described the fear, the flames, the silence that followed. Their testimonies aligned perfectly. With each word, the case against Rakesh grew stronger. The man who had confidently manipulated the truth was now unraveling. As word spread that the investigation had been reopened, the village shifted. What was once passed off as a kitchen accident began to feel like something darker, something everyone had known deep down but didn't want to admit. Surapore, a village used to looking away, began to look inward. Unease replaced indifference. Whispers traveled faster than prayer bells. Was it really an accident? Did you hear what the daughter said? She always looked tired, sad. Officers from the district crime branch descended on the Sharma residence with fresh eyes. They moved through the home slowly, methodically, documenting every inch. They noted the scorch marks on the floorboards, the soot lining the edges of wooden furniture, and the lingering chemical stench that clung to the air like an accusation. The kitchen was inspected first. The stove was intact, no signs of explosion, no charred vessels or spilled oil. Everything was in order. But Priya's bedroom was another story. It was blackened from floor to ceiling, burned in a concentrated area, directly on her side of the bed. The mattress, now mostly ash, showed signs of accelerant use. Investigators noted the presence of kerosene residues. The ignition had been deliberate, directed, controlled. More damning was the door to the daughter's room, scarred by heat, with a metal latch that bore signs of external locking. It wasn't an accident. It was entrapment. Forensics began to contradict the original claims. The fire didn't behave like a cooking mishap. It spread too uniformly. It ignited too cleanly. This wasn't a kitchen accident. It was an execution. Officers turned to the villagers. Slowly, voices began to crack through the silence. A shopkeeper recalled seeing Priya with fresh bruises on her wrist. Another neighbor mentioned hearing shouting on the night of the fire. A midwife confessed that Priya had once confided in her about being forced to terminate pregnancies she didn't want to end. She had begged for advice, for help. No one had stepped forward then. But now, with cameras rolling and officers listening, they began to speak. It wasn't a single moment of violence that defined Priya's story. It was a pattern, a slow, methodical wearing down of a woman who had once been full of life. The kind of abuse that left no headlines, only bruises that faded and eyes that stopped meeting your gaze. And through it all, her daughters watched. But now, they weren't just witnesses to suffering. They were the voice of justice. They were the daughters who didn't look away when the rest of the world did. And the world had no choice but to listen. Patterns emerged, not of a single moment of violence, but of a long, calculated erosion of a woman's life. Interviews with local shopkeepers and clinic workers revealed more. One chemist confirmed that Rakesh had made repeated purchases of strong sedatives and medication often associated with termination of pregnancy. No prescriptions, no questions asked. A nearby pharmacist hesitantly shared that Priya had once visited with deep exhaustion etched into her face. She hadn't spoken much, but she had looked as if the weight of her world had become too much to bear. The investigation turned toward medical records, scant and scattered. Yet even in fragmented notes, a pattern became evident. Multiple pregnancies, multiple terminations, no official documentation of gender determination tests, but a consistent timeline that aligned with unreported procedures and periods of visible distress. The daughters' statements became the spine of the case. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were consistent, detailed, and corroborated by physical evidence. They recounted how they had been locked in their room on the day of the fire, how they had seen their mother soaked in kerosene through the narrow space between a curtain and a half-closed window, how their father had left the house shortly before flames consumed everything. Their testimonies matched the forensic timelines. Kerosene residue, burn patterns, wrist injuries, all pointed to a crime that had not been sudden but staged. The post-mortem, initially avoided, was now ordered under judicial directive. It confirmed what the investigators already suspected. Priya had defensive wounds on her arms and wrists. Her lungs showed signs of struggle before she inhaled the flame. She had not fallen asleep. She had not spilled anything. She had fought, but her struggle had not been enough. The final nail in the narrative was Rakesh's own behavior under pressure. Rakesh grew tense. His accounts shifted with every interview. He first claimed he was with his wife during the fire. Then he stated he was outside. Later, he mentioned returning to find the flames already ablaze, though the evidence clearly showed the door to the bedroom had been locked. His contradictions only deepened as details unfolded, but the officers had prepared for this. He was arrested under Section 302 of the Indian Penal Code, homicide. Additional charges included cruelty against a spouse and destruction of evidence. By then, the story had already made national headlines. The courtroom in Bulandshahr where the trial would unfold was packed with journalists, legal observers, and a growing number of advocates who saw in Priya's case a reflection of thousands of women whose voices had been lost to tradition and silence. The trial opened with the prosecution laying bare the pattern of control and abuse. Priya's life was presented not as a single tragedy, but a chronicle of systematic dehumanization, forced abortions, denied autonomy, beatings disguised as discipline, and a final act of violence meant to erase her entirely. The court was shown forensic slides detailing the ignition point and burn radius. Witnesses, including the girls, testified under oath. Their statements were calm, factual, and horrifying in their clarity. They described the morning of the fire, the lock on their door, the smell of kerosene, and their mother's final cries. The defense attempted to cast doubt, suggesting external coaching, family vendettas, mental illness, but none of it held. The judge observed that the girls' testimonies remained consistent through cross-examination and aligned precisely with physical evidence gathered independently by forensic teams. The final day of trial was tense. The courtroom sat in silence as the judge delivered the verdict. Priya Sharma was found guilty of homicide. In his closing remarks, the judge condemned the act not just as homicide, but as a symbol of deep-rooted gender prejudice. He cited Priya's brutal killing as a result of a patriarchal mindset that devalues women, especially when they give birth to daughters. He sentenced Rakesh to life imprisonment without parole and imposed a financial penalty to be paid directly to the surviving daughters. There was no applause in the courtroom. No dramatic reaction. Meera and Nisha sat side by side, eyes fixed on the bench ahead of them. There were no tears. Just a stillness that came from knowing the man who had taken everything from them would never again walk free. Justice had not come easily. It had required courage, persistence, and a blood-stained letter written by a child too young to bear such loss. But it had come, and in that courtroom, Priya Sharma was no longer just a victim. She had become a voice, echoing through every testimony, every ruling, and every heart that now knew her story. After the verdict was handed down, the village of Surapore seemed to return to normal. But it wasn't the same. The Sharma house, once shielded by walls that hid years of pain, stood hollow and quiet. Its doors no longer opened. The windows remained shut. Vines crept up its sides, the paint peeled in silence, and the whispers of the past clung to the air like smoke that refused to clear. The home was no longer a place of fear. It was now a symbol of what had been endured, what had been ignored, and what had finally been exposed. Meera and Nisha Sharma left Surapore soon after the trial ended. Their mother's family took them in a town far enough away that the name Rakesh Sharma didn't echo through alleyways. In this new place, they were not daughters of tragedy. They were students, teenagers, survivors. They returned to school, slowly relearning how to live without looking over their shoulders. But grief doesn't vanish with geography. Meera, now 2 years older, often carried a notebook, filled not with schoolwork but with memories she refused to forget. Nisha also kept a photo of their mother in her drawer. They never spoke of the fire unless asked, but its shadow lived quietly in their routines, in the way they paused near locked doors, or how they looked away when someone raised their voice. The case prompted disciplinary action against local officials. The constable who had closed the case without investigation was suspended. The medical officer who failed to report Priya's injuries was quietly transferred. Under pressure, the district introduced a new policy. Any woman's death involving burns would now require automatic forensic review and a mandatory inquiry. It was progress, but hard-earned, and too late for Priya Sharma. Her daughters had forced a system to listen. But the question still lingered. Why did it take a handwritten letter in blood to begin with? Priya's story wasn't isolated. It was one of thousands. But it stood out because of what followed. Because two girls, barely teenagers, dared to challenge the man who raised them and the silence that had protected him. In doing so, they didn't just bring justice for their mother. They exposed the very culture that allowed her suffering to go unchecked. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or opened your eyes, subscribe to our channel for more real-life crime documentaries and fictional stories inspired by true events. We uncover the darkest corners of human nature, so you can be more aware, more informed, and maybe even safer. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something just isn't right.